Hello, I'm Des Dealer from the Thinkers 50. I'm joined by Erin Meyer, who's a professor at INSEAD and the author of The Culture Map, and we're talking at the European Business Forum. Erin, tell us a little bit about the book. What's the big idea behind The Culture Map?
So what I've done with The Culture Map is map out 55 world cultures on different behavioral scales. So we can look at how different countries make decisions differently, how trust is built differently in different parts of the world. And then as your company expands internationally, you can compare your corporate culture to the national cultures that you're moving into and think about how to be more strategic based on those differences.
So as a company expands globally, I mean, you're the culture expert. You're the go-to person on culture. What sort of problems do they encounter, and are people aware of the cultural differences?
One of the things that I find is that corporations often have very strong cultures which may be linked to the country that they originated from. I've been working with a Silicon Valley company who has a culture that's very focused on being extremely direct when you give negative feedback. They moved into a huge amount of countries last year, and they had to really think about how that directness would match with Brazilians who are not so direct, or even more so Indonesia. So it's important that the companies start thinking very carefully about their own identities and how those identities might evolve as they're moving into different countries around the world.
I mean, interestingly too, I mean, the American culture, for all we think of Americans, and I know you're American, as being direct, you're not so direct when it comes to feedback, not usually.
Well, in comparison to Europeans, Americans are particularly indirect. So what I mean by that is Americans are very transparent in most areas, focus on transparency. But when it comes to giving negative feedback, Americans tend to wrap a lot of positives around their messages. I mean, we're trained to give 3 positives with every negative, catch people doing things right. That can be very confusing for Europeans. I work a lot with French managers living in France as I do, and when they have American bosses, often they leave their performance reviews not knowing, was that a good performance review or a bad performance review? That's something we as leaders need to be aware of.
And I know I've heard you say too that quite often a culture will have evolved because of the history of the people or of a country. So how does that apply to the American culture? I mean, I know it's a low context culture.
Yeah, so Americans generationally are becoming less and less direct with negative feedback. And we see that the millennials who are coming up now are expecting more positive feedback in the workplace and are more sensitive to negative feedback. And in a way that brings them closer to most Asian and Latin American countries, but also means that the gap is larger between the US and Europe.
So you've got the US on one extreme in terms of low context, and a country like Japan on the other extreme?
Right, so the Japanese culture is a culture where people really focus on picking up subtle messages in the air, whereas in the US we're taught to be very literal when we speak. There's an expression in Japanese which is kuki yomanai. It means someone who is unable to pick up the subtle messages in the atmosphere. I was giving a presentation in Japan a few years ago, and when I spoke to the audience, I asked if there were any questions at the end, and no one raised their hand, so I went to sit down. And my Japanese colleague, he said, "No, Erin, there were some questions." And then he stood up, he said, "Does anyone have any questions?" And he actually saw questions in the audience that I had not seen, meaning these people were just sitting there quietly, not speaking, and he looked at them and said, "Oh, do you have a question?" And they said, "Oh, thank you, I do." So afterwards, I said, "How did you know those people had questions?" And he said, "Well, it had to do with how bright their eyes were." So I just thought that was a great example of how in the Japanese culture, like in most East Asian cultures, people pick up a lot of these subtle messages that are just in the atmosphere. And me as an American, I was clearly kuki yomanai in this situation, unable to pick up those messages.
And presumably that's partly about eye contact, because Eastern cultures quite often don't look directly in the eye unless they want to.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great example of how once you understand these differences, you can really use them more effectively. So what my Japanese colleague said to me, he said, Erin, when you ask if there are questions, scan the room and look if anybody is looking directly at you. And when you look at them, if they hold your gaze and their eyes are a little bright, that means that they'd like you to call on them. And when I just understood that technique, I realized that I could be much more effective managing my international classrooms, that there were all these bright eyes that otherwise I was entirely missing.
Fantastic. Now, this is your first time at the Euro. It's the first ever European Business Forum. How has the experience been for you?
It's been just fantastic. We have a very senior audience today. We have people from all over the world, very interesting questions, incredible energy. It's been an amazing experience.
And I'm getting extremely positive feedback about your session. I hope you enjoyed it as much as the audience did.
Thank you. I loved it. Thank you very much. Yes, they were a pleasure.